The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made every little sound feel louder than it should. The faint ticking of the clock, the quiet rustling of papers, the heavy breathing of those waiting for their turn. All of it created a tense atmosphere. Judge Williams, an older man with tired eyes but a sharp mind, sat behind his high wooden bench, flipping through case files. He had seen all kinds of people walk through those doors. Some guilty, some innocent, and some just caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But today, something felt different. Then, the doors at the back creaked open. A small girl, no older than 10, stepped forward. She was thin, almost too thin, and her clothes were worn out, hanging loosely on her frail frame. Her hair was braided, neatly, but it was clear that she hadn't had a proper meal in a while. She walked hesitantly toward the stand, her tiny hands clutching the edges of her oversized hoodie. The courtroom's usual murmurs faded as all eyes turned to her. People whispered to one another, trying to figure out why such a young child was standing in front of a judge. Judge Williams adjusted his glasses and looked down at her. "Young lady, can you state your name for the record?" His voice was firm, but not unkind. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "My name is Aaliyah." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the room, it carried enough weight to make even the most hardened faces soften. "Aaliyah," the judge repeated, his tone gentle now. "Do you know why you're here today?" She nodded slowly, but kept her gaze down, staring at the polished wooden floor beneath her feet. "Yes, sir." "Can you tell me in your own words what happened?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. His curiosity piqued. There was a brief pause before Aaliyah lifted her head. Her dark brown eyes filled with something unspoken, something deeper than just fear. "I was hungry," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I didn't know what else to do." A ripple of quiet gasps spread through the courtroom. A few people exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's brows furrowed. "Hungry?" he repeated. "What do you mean, Aaliyah?" She swallowed hard, her hands gripping her sleeves. I didn't have any food at home. My mama..." Her voice cracked, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. "She's sick, and we ran out of food 2 days ago. I tried to wait, but she kept getting weaker. I didn't want to steal, I swear. I just wanted something to eat." A heavy silence settled over the room. Even the most experienced lawyers, used to all kinds of cases, looked down uncomfortably. The judge sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he simply watched the little girl in front of him, her small frame looking even smaller under the weight of the situation. "And what did you do?" he finally asked. Aaliyah lowered her head again. "I went into a store," she admitted. "They had fresh bread on the shelf. I just wanted one loaf, just to take home for my mama. But the store owner saw me." She sniffled. "I tried to tell him I was going to pay later, but he didn't listen. He called the police." At this, a man sitting at the prosecution table, presumably the store owner, shifted in his seat. He looked uncomfortable now, avoiding the gazes of those around him. The officer who had arrested Aaliyah stood near the entrance, his face unusually solemn. Judge Williams exhaled slowly. He had heard many excuses in his courtroom before, but this wasn't an excuse. This was something else. A child, barely 10 years old, standing before him, not because of mischief or crime, but because of desperation. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice softer than before, "was there no one you could ask for help? No neighbor, no friend?" She shook her head. "Mama doesn't like asking for help. She says we gotta be strong." Her lip trembled, but she forced herself to stay still. I didn't want to make her feel bad. I just wanted to help. The judge tapped his fingers lightly on the wooden desk. Deep in thought, he glanced around the room, taking in the reactions of those present. Some looked away, clearly ashamed. Others looked at Aaliyah with pity. But pity wasn't what she needed. She needed something more. Then, without warning, Judge Williams did something that left everyone in the courtroom stunned. Judge Williams leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wooden desk. The weight of the moment pressed down on the courtroom, like a thick fog. He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose, before looking back at the little girl standing in front of him. Aaliyah's hands were still clenched around the sleeves of her hoodie, her tiny shoulders tense as she waited for whatever came next. The air in the room was heavy with unspoken words. The store owner, a middle-aged man with graying hair, cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, as if suddenly aware of the judgmental stares around him. He had probably expected a simple case, child caught stealing, a quick punishment, and then moving on with his day. But now, the reality of Aaliyah's situation was sinking in, and it was clear he wasn't as sure of himself as he had been when he first pressed charges. The police officer who had arrested Aaliyah watched silently from the side of the room. He had followed protocol, doing what the law required. But now, standing in the presence of this child, this hungry, desperate child, his rigid posture softened. His eyes flickered with something close to regret. Judge Williams finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Aaliyah, do you understand what stealing means?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I know it's wrong." "Then why did you do it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Aaliyah's lip trembled, and she looked down at her worn-out sneakers. "Because my mom is sick, and I was hungry. I didn't know what else to do." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Even those who had walked into the courtroom that morning, with hardened hearts, couldn't ignore the lump forming in their throats. Judge Williams turned his gaze toward the store owner. "Mr. Parker," he said, addressing him by name, "do you wish to proceed with pressing charges?" The man hesitated. His fingers drummed against the table in front of him, his eyes darting between Aaliyah and the judge. "Well, he cleared his throat again. "It's not that I want to punish her, Your Honor. It's just, stealing is stealing. If I let one person get away with it, others will think they can do the same." The judge studied him for a long moment. "You mean adults will think they can do the same," he corrected. "But this is a child who is not trying to take for selfish reasons, but because she and her mother have nothing to eat." Mr. Parker's face turned slightly red, but he didn't argue. He was a businessman, not a cruel man. He had just never been put in a position like this before. A murmur spread through the courtroom, whispers of conversations between onlookers. Some shook their heads at the store owners. Lack of compassion. Others simply looked down, perhaps reflecting on how easy it was to judge someone until they knew the full story. Judge Williams turned back to Aaliyah. "You live with your mother?" She nodded. "Just me and her. Where is your father?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "He left when I was little." "And your mother?" His voice was gentle, but the question carried weight. "What's wrong with her?" Aaliyah swallowed hard. She can't get out of bed some days. She's real tired all the time. Sometimes she forgets things. We used to have food stamps, but I don't think she got them this month." She rubbed her arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to get in trouble. I just wanted to help her." The judge sighed, glancing at the officer standing near the entrance. "Did anyone check on her mother?" The officer cleared his throat. I went by their apartment when I picked Aaliyah up. The place is not in good shape. His jaw tightened. It looked like they haven't had a proper meal in a while. A quiet sadness filled the room. It wasn't just about stolen bread anymore. This was bigger than one small act of desperation. This was about a system that had failed a child and her sick mother. Judge Williams exhaled slowly. He looked at Aaliyah, who stood before him, small and scared, yet somehow braver than most adults who had ever entered his courtroom. Then, to everyone's surprise, he did something no one expected. He stood up. The movement alone was enough to send a ripple of confusion through the room. Judges didn't just stand in the middle of cases, but there he was, stepping away from his bench and walking down toward where Aaliyah stood. The bailiff instinctively moved to stop him, but Judge Williams lifted a hand, signaling that it was fine. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with Aaliyah, his voice quiet but strong. "Aaliyah," he said, "I need you to listen to me carefully." She nodded, her big brown eyes wide with uncertainty. "You are not a criminal," he told her. "You are not a thief. You are a little girl who should never have been put in a position like this. Do you understand?" Aaliyah blinked, as she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Yes, sir." Judge Williams turned to the courtroom. "Is there anyone here, any single person, who believes this child should be punished for trying to survive?" Silence. Not one person spoke. Then, something happened that left everyone stunned. The judge reached into his robe, pulled out his wallet, and took out a few bills. He turned back to Mr. Parker, holding the money out to him. "Here's enough to cover what she took, and more." Mr. Parker stared at the money, then at Aaliyah, then at the judge. Slowly he shook his head. "No, Your Honor," he said, pushing the money away. "That's not necessary. I shouldn't have called the police. I didn't know." His voice was thick with emotion. "I'm sorry." Aaliyah looked up at him, not sure what to say. Then, from the back of the room, someone stood up. A woman, dressed in a modest but clean outfit, cleared her throat. "I run a food pantry," she said. "She and her mother can come by any time. They won't go hungry again." Another person stood. "I own a small restaurant down the street. I can make sure they get a hot meal every day." One by one, people in the courtroom spoke up, offering groceries, medical help for her mother, even legal aid to get their benefits reinstated. Judge Williams looked around, nodding in quiet approval. "That," he said, "is how we take care of our own." Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears. Not of sadness, but of something else, hope, and for the first time since she had walked into that courtroom, she smiled. Aaliyah wiped her eyes quickly, almost as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Just moments ago, she had been standing in front of a judge, scared and ashamed, thinking she had made the worst mistake of her life. But now, the entire courtroom, the same people who had watched her in silence, were offering to help her. Judge Williams stood up, looking around at the people who had spoken. There was a different kind of energy in the room now. It was no longer just about a stolen loaf of bread. It was about something bigger, something that had been ignored for too long. He turned back to Aaliyah and spoke gently. "You are not alone. Do you hear me?" She nodded, her small fingers gripping the sleeves of her hoodie tighter. It was as if she was holding on to his words, afraid they might disappear. The store owner, Mr. Parker, took a slow step forward. His face was still red with embarrassment, but his voice was steady. "Aaliyah," he said, clearing his throat, "I was wrong. I should have asked why, instead of just assuming. I should have listened." He glanced at the judge, then back at her. "I want to make it right. You and your mama can come by my store anytime. You won't have to worry about food again." Aaliyah's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, she just nodded. The officer who had arrested her stepped forward next. He had been quiet all this time, but now he looked directly at Judge Williams. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to personally check on Aaliyah's mother. Make sure she gets the care she needs." Judge Williams gave a firm nod. That would be the right thing to do. Aaliyah looked around, her eyes darting between the people who had just moments ago felt like strangers. Now, they weren't just faces in a courtroom. They were people who cared. People who had been reminded that sometimes the law isn't just about punishment. It's about justice, about kindness, about doing what is right. Judge Williams tapped his gavel lightly. The court finds that there is no reason to proceed with any charges. He looked back at Aaliyah. "You're free to go, sweetheart." Aaliyah's lips trembled, and then, as if realizing that the weight she had been carrying was finally lifting, she took a deep breath. As she turned to leave, the woman from the food pantry stepped forward. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, with a warm smile. "Let's go see your mama." The moment Aaliyah stepped out of the courtroom, she felt the cool air hit her face. It wasn't just a change in temperature. It was a change in everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't just thinking about what she would eat, how she would take care of her mother, or what she had to do just to make it through another day. She was thinking about something else. Hope. And as she walked down the steps of the courthouse, she knew her life would never be the same again.